Bischoff and Wes Briscoe. Hulk Hogan, you didn't answer my phone calls for 2 years. Did you forget something, Hogan? Hulk Hogan.
Alright, the Hulk Hogan Show episode 2, let's get straight into it. Here are all the wrestlers who signed a TNA contract in 2009. Lacey Von Erich, F. Come on, what did you think she's going to get? She was absolutely atrocious in the ring, she never got any better, and she was an embarrassment every time she got in the ring. There was always that fan in the front row with the funny Lacey Von Botch sign. She wasn't a beautiful people, and she sort of had a tag team title reign under the Freebird rule. I don't know, she didn't stick around for long. She also went through a phase of letting men pay her for erotic wrestling one-on-one. Should have stuck to modelling. Eric Bischoff, C. Bit of a controversial one. I don't think Eric was actually that bad. I really do believe he was trying. Once Hulk Hogan was on TV a bit less, Bischoff carried on the run on his own, and it seemed like he was trying. He was the mastermind behind the Aces and Eights storyline, and even though I don't like the wrestlers involved in that storyline, it has to be said that took a lot of balls to do that storyline, and at least it was something interesting and different on TV. He certainly had too much screen time though, and he was a character that nobody really wanted to see. He was part of the grey hair crew. There were so many OAPs on TNA at one point. He was recently hired by WWE but stuck around for a cup of coffee, and now he's back to scraping through dumpsters for his dinner. The Pope, D'Angelo De Niro, B. Coming into TNA from his failed WWE run as Elijah Burke, the Pope lit up TNA screens with his entertainment, charisma and his great matches. He was like a cross between The Rock and Jay Lethal, with his character and wrestling ability. His star did start to fade over time as he feuded with Devon and his kids for way too long, and it was a pointless feud that killed his character off. He then stopped wrestling, and it was rumoured that he was injured, but then he returned to TNA as an announcer and did a pretty good job. Amazing Red, B. Oh, every time I see Amazing Red I can't help but think what could have been with this guy. He was incredible in the ring. It was like watching a video game when he had a match. He was obviously one of the original X Division pioneers, but when he returned to TNA in 2009 he had a real mixed bag. He did win the X Division title, which was obviously a big highlight, but then he got stuck with trash gimmicks like the Sangriento gimmick, where TNA wanted him to be the new masked wrestler, and it was a disgusting looking cheap outfit that looks like it had cheese strings glued to the back of the mask. He only had 3 matches in this gimmick. He also had Don West as his manager and his biggest fanboy, but this only lasted for a few matches as well. It was like TNA didn't know what to do with the guy. Come on, he books himself, he's amazing in the ring. People can get behind that. Cody Dina, F. I'm sure there's some weirdos out there who found this guy entertaining, but to me he was like nails on a chalkboard every time he got on the mic. The guy was Canadian, but he was billed from Alabama and was doing a hillbilly hit gimmick. He spent most of his time hanging around with ODB, making out and being annoying. I can't think of any good matches he had, but interestingly he did return to TNA this year, as TNA is now in Canada, and that's where he's actually from. Hamada, D. Yeah, she could have been a lot better as well. She was one of the better wrestlers on the show, but for some reason her gimmick didn't seem to translate well to American TV. She won the Knockout Tag Team titles with Awesome Kong, and also with Taylor Wilde. She was never the focus of anything, and I remember a lot of fans wanted to see more of her, but they never got their wish. Desmond Wolfe, F. Look, I'm giving him an F for one reason. It's not his fault. He was completely wasted and mismanaged by TNA. He could have been an A, easily. His feud with Kurt Angle when he first came into the company was one of the best things on TV that year, but then he quickly went downhill as Hulk Hogan joined the company, who didn't see any star power in him. But then he started having feuds with the Pope, and despite winning the TNA fan poll where fans could choose the number 1 contender for the world title, this was completely ignored. Desmond Wolfe was completely wasted, and I hate Hogan for this. Bobby Lashley and his wife Crystal Lashley, D. I don't really remember what they were doing. They feuded with Steiner quite a lot. He wasn't on TV that much. He looked like a big star whenever he was on TV though against the other wrestlers. Lashley appeared on the first episode of the Monday Night Wars against WWE, where he said he didn't want to be in TNA and quickly left thereafter. Waste of time. Raven, D. This was one of Raven's many returns to TNA, and in this return he was paired up with all the insane people with Dr. Stevie and Daphne. He mostly lost matches and there wasn't really anything built up around him. He looked about 90 years old and looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Hulk Hogan, F. Should have built amazing star power to TNA and should have really moved the needle and helped new fans discover the TNA products, but he didn't. He made it all about himself, and that's why many TNA fans hate him to this day. Before Hogan came into the company, TNA was on fire, and it was definitely better than WWE. But by the time Hogan left the company, there was no money left, and all the big stars like AJ Styles were asked to take pay cuts, and this led to all the well-known TNA stars leaving. When he left the company, his final segment on TV was Dixie Carter begging on her knees for Hulk Hogan not to go. He couldn't even leave with any dignity, despite all the money they paid him. Shane Douglas, F. He returned to TNA after about a 2-year hiatus and briefly feuded with Christopher Daniels. He even had a pay-per-view match against him, but he lost. Dr. Stevie, C. At least it was interesting. He came into TNA as the therapist for Abyss. He wasn't seen on TV for the first 2 months, but you could tell from his voice it was going to be Stevie Richards. He ended up feuding with Abyss for his entire run with TNA, but then he had to quit TNA because he said TNA weren't paying him enough money for him to live. Nowadays he can be found making podcasts while scraping the bottom of the margarine jar onto his toast. The Young Bucks. C. The wrestler in TNA is Generation Me. The name was rubbish. Look, I'm not a fan of this type of wrestling, but I have to say they were an exciting tag team to watch, and the fans seemed to certainly like them. They didn't win any gold whilst in TNA, but they did have some good matches with the Motor City Machine Guns. They then started hanging around with Tara and turned heel, but that didn't last long, and then they just disappeared from TNA. Their run should have gone on longer, and at the time everyone thought TNA was insane by not tying them down to a longer contract. Jenna Maraska. F. She was famous for being in the TV programme Survivor, but that doesn't mean she should go and be a pro wrestler. She joined the Main Event Mafia as Kevin Nash's friend, and she was meant to be the financial backer for the Mafia, and she was meant to be the one who helped Joe come into the Mafia with her money. I swear if all these guys put their money together, they'd easily have more money than her. How famous is she? She then said she was being trained as a wrestler by Awesome Kong, and then went and had one of the worst matches of all time in TNA history against Charmel at Victory Road. Absolutely woeful, and she was on a lot more money than most of the other wrestlers, whilst they are sleeping rough and reading what species of rat are edible. Naito and Yodio. No Limit. D. Good wrestlers. They were part of the talent exchange that was going on with the New Japan Pro Wrestling Federation at the time. They're often overlooked because everyone talks about how Kyoshi and Hamada were in TNA, but these two guys are often forgotten. They were actually there when the World Elite formed, with Sheikh Abdul Bashir, but then they quickly disappeared. They only really had matches on TNA Explosion, they were just dropped for the company for no reason. Jesse Neal. F. He was trained by the Dudley Boys and I absolutely hated him. He had stupid tattoos and a dumb mohawk. He didn't do anything apart from team with Shannon Moore and Ink Inc. I don't think he had any good matches. And when he ended up getting released, Toxin was also released, who was part of the team. So she hates him as much as we all do. Sally, Boy and Big Rocco. Security for the Main Event Mafia. F. A bit like how Gunner and Murphy would get a lot of TV time in later years, these two guys also got TV time for no reason. All they did was get beat up on TV, and while they were eventually fired from the Main Event Mafia, they made a few sporadic appearances backstage. The bad stench of Sally Boy's breath stuck around for a while, but thankfully they disappeared eventually. Taz. F. One of the bigger names on this list. When he first came into the company, everyone was excited, but then they realised the guy couldn't wrestle. The little fat midget was then friends with Samoa Joe because they were both overweight and liked MMA. This friendship, however, never went anywhere, but Taz would also seem to root for Samoa Joe on commentary. Taz was eventually revealed as a member of the Aces and Eights at Bully Ray's wedding, and this was a legit surprise. This meant that Taz was a heel on commentary, and he was absolutely unbearable. He made fun of all the wrestlers' names, made sexist comments, and just didn't give a damn about the job he was doing. He would often threaten people when most people could flatten the little fat boy. He thinks he's tough, but he really isn't. Chelsea. I don't know, C? I don't really know what to grade her. She wasn't a wrestler, she was just there to be eye candy. And that's what she did. She was Desmond Wolfe's manager, and she also looked after Ric Flair when he was in his wheelchair quite a lot. Sarita. B. TNA could have probably gone a bit further with Sarita, but she was one of the great TNA knockouts that made the division so good at the time. She won the TNA Knockouts tag team titles twice, with Taylor Wilde and Rosita. In my opinion, she was much better as a face when she was teaming with Taylor Wilde, as she got to show off more of her luchador moves. But later she was part of the terrible wrestling faction known as Mexican America. Rob Terry. F. I absolutely hate talking about this guy. This big roider did nothing in TNA throughout his entire TNA run. He had about 3 moves, and he looked like an angry red pimple whenever he gritted his teeth. He won the TNA Global title and had a terrible feud with Orlando Jordan, which seemed to be focused around how Orlando Jordan fancied him. He was also part of the British Invasion, and then for a long time he teamed with Robbie E as his bouncer. He then had a stay in the short-lived faction The Menagerie, where he was the strongman who wore a mask because everyone was sick of seeing his ugly face. Rob Terry was a complete waste of money. He never got over. The closest he got over was doing some goofy dancing gimmick, but even TNA didn't seem to want to go through with this and were embarrassed about it. Tomko. F. He had runs in WWE and TNA prior to this, but this is a short-lived 2009 run that not many people can remember. He came back into TNA as a jobber. He was a mystery man who attacked AJ Styles in a match, and then he ended up getting a world title shot, but he lost this. And then for the rest of the year he spent just losing every single match. I don't think he won a single one, so what was the point in him being there? And he looked a bit out of shape at the time as well. I don't think he wanted to be there, so why did he bother? Tomko, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Tara. A. Probably one of the best signings on this list. She was used properly. She came out of WWE where she'd been treated as an absolute joke for years, and now she was in TNA with a point to prove. She had some great wrestling matches and won the knockout title multiple times. Eventually her knees started to give way and the braces on her knees got bigger and bigger until she could barely walk. Then she formed an on-screen relationship with Jessie. She also had a tag team with Miss Tessmacher known as TNT and had a pretty good run for a woman in TNA. Nothing stupid happened with her, can't complain. Well done, Tara. You have won this list. Jethro Holiday, F. Formerly known in WWE as Trevor Murdock, he was the tag team champion with Lance Kane, but by the time he arrived in TNA he was completely washed up. TNA had absolutely nothing for him. He achieved nothing in TNA apart from being the second fattest white guy in TNA after Samoa Joe. After less than a year, he left TNA. Nowadays he wrestles for the NWA, which is quite exciting, and he also installs fibre optic wires for businesses, so it sounds like he knows he's never going to make it big in wrestling again. And finally, Cassandro, F. Look, this guy didn't even make it to TNA TV. Not many people might know about this one, but Cassandro was a Mexican wrestler who was signed by TNA, and he was going to debut as a wrestler called Andromeda. He was a Mexican luchador with a camp brash style. He was meant to debut on TNA pay-per-view, but 3 days before he was due to appear, Terry Taylor called him and said that he didn't have a job. TNA used the excuse that the company was PG-13 and couldn't have a gimmick like his on TV. Despite less than a year later, Orlando Jordan was scarring our eyes on TV. I don't know what the deal with this guy was, but he certainly has a big case against TNA and calls them the most homophobic company in the world. But hide that old school TNA footage of AJ Styles quickly. Well, that's it. Every wrestler who signed with TNA in 2009. Hope you enjoyed episode 2. Episode 3 will be later in the month.